Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world, with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
200 children lose contact with their fathers every day in secret courts in this country, where nearly 4 million children are fatherless. 1 in 3 children live without their father. £44 billion is the cost of family breakdown every year. 50% of children in the UK will have seen their parents divorce by the time they are 16. 1 in 3 children will lose contact with their father permanently. 70% of young offenders come from lone parent families. In many parts of the UK, the majority of children are fatherless. In London, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham and Leeds, over 50% of children live in fatherless families. Fathers for Justice have scaled the battlements of even Buckingham Palace in the early days in their Batman suits to draw attention to the elephant in the corner of the room, which the political class and their media echo chamber hope you won't notice. Children need fathers. And if the father and mother have to split up, then shared parenting is the best solution. We are joined by the happily enjoined married couple, Matt and Nadine O'Connor, who founded Fathers for Justice 12 years ago this month, and who are the most redoubtable campaigners in the land. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, George.
These statistics are simply astounding. In these great cities of England, half of the children are living in fatherless families, and yet the justice system is failing them. Tell us.
Well, as you've rightly pointed out in your introduction there, George, that this is a major social catastrophe. It's unfolding before us, and yet our political class are doing absolutely nothing about it to address this problem. We live in a country where it is easier to father somebody else's children rather than your own. And what we've been trying to do since I started the campaign 12 years ago is to raise awareness of this issue. We have tried direct action, we have tried political engagement, but what we found is the people in Parliament do not want to speak to Fathers for Justice. They would rather speak to the Taliban than speak to us about this major social issue.
Nadine, was it the sight of Matt in a Batman suit that first attracted you to him?
Actually, I can honestly say, George, no. But I was at a Fathers for Justice meeting. I'd been going through the family courts, and a girlfriend of mine said, you know, your case sounds very similar to that of many fathers. Why don't you go to Fathers for Justice and ask them some questions, get some help and advice? And I did. I went along to a meeting, and that's where I met Matt.
Nadine, the point that you make implicitly is that this is a problem affecting both men and women as well as children. The assumption is, in the justice system, I can tell you as a legislator, as the Americans put my job, that nobody's really listening. I've been trying through motions on the order paper and public meetings in the Parliament, as you well know, to interest more parliamentarians in this. Why are they so unmoved by these astounding statistics? And the £44 billion price tag. You'd think that alone would attract the politicians.
Well, you've kind of got the answer there. It's not necessarily the price tag, but it's the money that the family court justice system also generates. I mean, I have a strong belief that while it's costing a lot of money, I think that it's actually helping the economy in this country at the moment. And family breakdown, as a direct result, will create sort of two of everything. If you split up, you both can't take the freezer, so you have to get another freezer in the new house. So everything gets multiplied. So actually, I think that it generates a lot of money for this country. The family law industry, the solicitors, the barristers, everybody is making an awful lot of money out of this.
And it's secret courts. Yeah. This is something, you see, on the face of it, you would want these things to remain private because you don't want to expose children to schoolyard ridicule and so on. But in secret courts, anything can happen by definition.
And it does. I mean, we've had several cases going on in the press at the moment where a father's been in court for 12 years trying to get contact with his daughter. Now, I mean, 12 years is nearly the child's lifetime. I mean, it's completely unacceptable. The statistics that you talk about at the beginning, they're not statistics that we should be proud of in this country. It's absolutely disgusting that we're still sitting here 12, 13 years after the start of our campaign talking to you about this. You would think that, as you say, nobody wants to discuss their dirty linen in private. That is a private matter, but the secrecy of the courts does allow parents to pit themselves against each other. It does allow the industry to carry on, and then there's no accountability.
The most important thing here is that we have an unelected, unaccountable, unsackable judiciary operating in complete secrecy that refuses, in the case of the father that's been discussed recently, who's been going for the court for 12 years, has 100 court appearances. Not one of those court orders has been enforced. They are not worth the paper they're printed on. Yet we will send mothers to prison for not sending little Johnny to go to school. We will fine motorists for going 4 miles an hour over the speed limit, but we will do nothing when it comes to ensuring the rights of children to see their fathers are protected. And there's more legislation protecting dogs in this country than there is the relationship, the sacred bond between children and their fathers. I've got 3 boys, and I want my children to be judged not on the basis of their gender, but on the content of their character. What sort of society are we creating when boys grow up in fatherless families with all the consequences that flow from that?
70% of young offenders.
Absolutely, the
families.
highest rate of young offending in Western Europe.
Most children who are harmed in domestic settings. Most children who are harmed in domestic settings are harmed by their mother's new boyfriend.
Yeah.
The mother's new boyfriend is never vetted by anybody. No. He can be literally anybody. You could have a long litter of convictions of all kinds behind him, but he can move in to the mother's life and therefore your children's life, and no one will ever ask him a single question, at least until it's too late. Whilst the father has to go through hoops to get a court order, to get contact with his child. Contact, what a word.
Terrible.
With your own child. Because you broke up from your child's mother, you have to apply for contact with your own children.
And then you have to prove you're worthy of it. That's
you have to prove you're worthy of it.
The week before, you were perfectly okay. You were doing the school run, you're doing dinner, taking them swimming, everything. And then the day after that you separate, you have to prove you're worthy.
Yeah, because they always assume this of the father's role, that he's the one who walks up.
Yeah, but they've also assumed there's actually brought in a presumption where every father poses a risk to his child. Because every father is now risk assessed. Regardless, you are risk assessed. When you go into the court system, CAFCAS will risk assess you using soft evidence, which is allegations, and hard evidence, which is anything relating to police and police reports. So you are assumed by this government, by this country, by the state to be a risk to your children, even though days or a week earlier you were safely at home looking after them.
And that's where we come back to the secret court thing, because you say, if you make an allegation against somebody in a criminal court, you have to prove that allegation's true. You have to provide the evidence. In a family court, you have to provide no evidence whatsoever. They can simply act on your word.
It's like a Salem-style witch hunt. I point a finger at you. Yeah. You're guilty.
You and I are married. We split up. You don't want me to have any role in the children's life, so you have an incentive to say bad things about me. Bad things which in a secret court will be implicitly believed unless I can really go the extra mile to disprove them.
Yeah, and what's the best way of me punishing you? What's my motivation? If I want to punish you for whatever the reason is to deny you access to the people you love and care about the most. And that's the motivating factor. We know full well that men would do it to women given the opportunity. Yeah. But the law itself is very cleverly drafted. It doesn't discriminate in the legislation, but what it does do is discriminate in the application of the law. And the thing that makes a mockery of it, as I've said already, is the fact that the court orders, which are written, are absolutely worthless. Well, you can spend tens of thousands of pounds, as many people have done, and you have got nothing to show for it at the end of it.
Well, I know some people who have spent tens of thousands of pounds in court, employing barristers, winning the case, getting an order, and then, as you said earlier, the other parent simply refuses to implement the order, and nothing happens to them.
No.
How can that be?
Well, it's completely wrong. The judges wash their hands of it. I mean, we've seen this case recently of this father who spent 12 years going through the court system, and the judges go, well, there's nothing we can do. Really? You enforce the law, you send mothers to prison over not sending kids to school, you give fines to motorists for going 4 miles an hour over the speed limit. You can simply transfer residence from one parent to the other if you're faced with a parent who is recalcitrant, who is failing to uphold that child's rights to see both parents. And what we do, what we present as a team of Fathers to Justice is, you know, it's not just about men versus women. We're a team because we've been through it, both of us have been through it, we've seen it from both sides. We've seen how family law fails children repeatedly. So for us, what we're trying to do as a campaign, Gayatri, is to get men and women to come together and say, hey, look, this is such a serious social issue. We're failing our children.
Well, that's the point. It's not that fathers have a right to see their children, though in my view they do.
Yeah,
The real issue is that the child has the right
No.
to see its father and be with its father, not in a contact, fleeting, easily withdrawn, timed, with the mother standing at the door
Or, of
with
course,
the
based
watch.
on money,
Well,
and if you don't pay any maintenance, you don't see the child. Sometimes it's a straight trade. You know, fathers are simply cash points in most cases.
And sperm back, we're cash points, we're sperm backs. These aren't contact orders, these are control orders. I mean, they are control orders. They control you. I mean, men are often accused of being controlling. Well, I can tell you, there's nothing more controlling than the court telling you when you can and can't see your children.
Oh.
Or to have you put in a contact centre for 2 hours on a Saturday to see your children. You know, unless you've posed some kind of serious risk to your children, no father should be put in a contact centre. Contact, as you've said, is something we used to have with aliens from outer space,
Indeed.
not of our own flesh
Not
and
with
blood.
our own. Last word to the mother of Fathers for Justice, Nadine. Is it likely to get better anytime soon, or are we still on a downward spiral with all this?
No, I don't see it getting better anytime soon. I mean, we had all the promises before the last election. The Conservative Party were going to change the law, we were going to hit the ground running. They failed to implement those promises. And at the moment, the Children and Families Bill that's going through, I think is just a fudge. It's not going to address the real issue. I think the problem's going to get worse. And to be honest, I really don't see this coming back on the proper political agenda until 2020, because I don't think anybody's going to raise it again before then. So I don't want to be here campaigning. Matt doesn't want to be here campaigning. We simply want the law changed. Is it too much to ask for equality in today's day and age?
Nadine and Matt O'Connor, Fathers for Justice. Thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up after the break is the only lobby correspondent at Westminster walking the corridors of power, led by a guide dog. Though blind, Sean Dilley can see things more clearly than most of the poodles to power plying their journalistic trade in Parliament. We'll be reviewing the political year with him right after this break. Welcome back to Sputnik. It's year 3 of the condemned coalition government, the beast with 2 backs, or at least 2 heads, David Cameron and Nick Clegg. There has been no previous peacetime wholesale coalition government in British history. And according to the opinion polls, the British people aren't enjoying the novelty very much, with the government trailing badly and seemingly headed for defeat. And yet, the official opposition don't seem to be filling people with confidence either. On the 2 most important polling questions, that of leadership and the economy, the Prime Minister still comes out ahead. So, with millions unemployed and a 4th austerity winter killing British pensioners in record numbers, is it possible that in the general election in 2015, the Condems could make a comeback? Who better to ask than the sage that is Sean Dilley and his wonderful dog, Chip. Sean, welcome on board the Sputnik. Let's begin with that question. Year 3, is the coalition in good fettle? Do they look like a team that might succeed at the next general election?
They seem like a very bickering team. Some have even called it in Westminster the knitting circle of hate. But I think we should actually be aware that in politics, as you know, George, anything can happen. So the answer is yes, they can return at the next election. They are lower than a snake's belly in a dirt track at the moment in terms of opinion polls. But when you look at the economy, the slight increase in the fortunes of the United Kingdom, which are still fairly bleak at the moment, it's at least possible that they could, as that election approaches, overcome sort of arguments about student tuition fees in the case of the smaller coalition party, in fact the minute one of the Liberal Democrats, and of course the economic handling, the age of austerity that would tighten any belt so tight that your thighs would surely split.
Well, on that point of split, you say they're bickering, circle of hate, and it's true that they appear to be making, as Marx put it, a narcissism of the small difference,
Yes.
magnifying it to extraordinary proportions. But there are real issues, aren't there? Like Europe.
Yes.
UKIP are rising on the Tories' right,
Yes.
making the European Union issue a big one, whilst the Liberal Democrats couldn't be more in love with the European Union if they tried. Is that going to split them asunder?
Probably not. I think the biggest issue for Europe is the Conservatives themselves. Whilst you combine the Europhiles and the Eurosceptics of the Liberal Democrats and Conservatives, at least the Liberal Democrats can use the excuse, we have different views. The Conservatives theoretically should be taking collective responsibility, so there's a huge cloud hanging over their head. Indeed, as the matters progressed through the House of Commons over the last year, we've seen a Conservative backbencher, a chap called James Wharton, laying a private members' bill trying to not only well, I would say not so much undermine what the Prime Minister's doing in terms of having a referendum in or out, but certainly undermining the timing, embarrassing number 10, and saying that referendum should happen now,
And,
not in
and
2017.
Michael Dobbs, author, of course,
The
of
House of Cards.
House of Cards, he's introducing a referendum bill into the Lords. So there's a Europhobic, you'd call it skeptic, I would say phobic.
You would probably call it xenophobic, George,
Yeah,
wouldn't you?
indeed, rabid, xenophobic, Europhobic
Yes.
wing of the Conservative Party. They're not letting David Cameron off the hook on
Well,
this.
see, one of the things as well, you mentioned the UK Independence Party. I would always suggest that the UK Independence Party is just Nigel Farage. Very charismatic politician. Aristotle said it's a mark of education to be able to entertain a view without necessarily holding it oneself. So no matter where you stand on the political sphere, and actually, George, politically, you're like this in the United Kingdom, people can support the oratory regardless of where they stand politically. Certainly when I interviewed Nigel Farage for my own show, the Hear Here show, earlier in the year, it was just fascinating that he more or less has an answer to everything. Now, you would say that that's true of every politician, but David Cameron, the Conservatives, recognise that they're dealing with someone who's making an argument which is incredibly seductive to, some might argue, the less informed in society, and then some might call
Well,
people
it's
patronising
millions,
for suggesting that.
whether they're well informed or not. It's
Yes.
it's millions of people. What about the economy? As Bill Clinton famously said, it's the economy is stupid. There is a slight increase in
Yes.
growth in the British economy. There is an increase, big one, in some parts of one city, London, in the housing market. But most of the country and most of the people in the country are still shivering in an austerity winter.
This is it, and I'm going to come on to that very serious matter and flipping aside the flippancy, which I will do very quickly, saying that George Osborne's argument that we may be lying in the political gutter, but we're at least looking at the pavement, probably isn't any comfort to those who are at the moment literally freezing cold because of the gas and electricity prices. Huge impact on the average man, woman and child in the street. So we talk about a recovering economy. You tell that to the people whose standard of life is going down. You tell that to all the increased people who are visiting. Here in the UK, we have food banks for people in extreme poverty, a bridging step theoretically, who need to turn effectively to charity to feed their children and themselves.
And yet, however low the Condemned coalition are in the polls, nobody much is in love with the opposition.
Well, how could you
neither
be?
its leader nor
Yeah.
its shadow chancellor.
But I think the problem is, and this actually, in fairness to the leader and the shadow chancellor, that's Ed Miliband and Ed Balls, who enjoy the traditional relationship between a leader and their Treasury spokesman.
They hate each other, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I think David Cameron has joked in the past that he and Ed Miliband have in common their hatred of Ed Balls. But I think, in fairness to them, it's very hard if you are the opposition to be taken at all seriously in the media, because you are reacting. All parties do this. Labour are particularly hot on whatever announcement, they'll stick a naysaying statement out. So, you know, they might say, oh, yes, it's fine for the Home Secretary to say this, but they need to get their house in order with the hope of being quoted in the press. Thing is, though, here in the United Kingdom, domestically, as indeed is internationally the case around the world, is as we run into the 2015 election, and I would suggest from next year's party political conferences, suddenly they're going to have and enjoy a much bigger platform, and that's where they're going to start making the impact.
Now, you
Yeah.
pay more attention than I do as a member of the House of Commons to who's up, who's down. Give me some rising figures, if you would, in the Conservatives and in the Labour.
Well, I mean, I tell you what, very, very relevant at the moment, to the time of recording. Don't know so much as raising in the Conservatives, but in politics generally. Zach Goldsmith, of course,
he's very impressive.
we saw him on our
He's
show.
very
He's
impressive.
amazing, very good.
Well, the thing is, of course, he came in under this kind of era of new conservatism with the green economy, and there was, you know, some might remember me saying at the time, in terms of various shows, that you know, once upon a time, you vote red, you get blue. If you vote blue, you get green. If you vote yellow, you're just being stupid. Whereas now it's, you know, if you vote blue or you vote yellow, you'll probably get a strange haze of grey. I think at the moment Zach Goldsmith's a rising star because he's saying that he may even cause a by-election in his constituency. You and I probably disagree on this because the position that Grant Shapps, the Conservative Party chairman, is in, I know that in the past you've interviewed him and gather that he's taken common sense lines. I think he's being restricted in that somewhat because at the moment obviously he's the Conservative
So that's
Party chairman.
Goldsmith and Shapps
Yes.
in the Tory party.
I'd say
Any
so.
Labour figures catching your eye?
Well, Chukwumana's star was rising earlier in the year, and it seemed to be kind of falling down a bit. Rachel Reeves has had some very interesting coverage. The Labour spokesperson, of course, being attacked by the Newsnight editor unwittingly in a twit-artet, a little Twitter mistake, by saying that she was boring, snoring Rachel Reeves. So I'd say that despite the Newsnight attack on her, she's probably rising there. The Liberal Democrats, they are all playing the violins, I'm afraid, on the Titanic. And unfortunately, of course, the Titanic is dead and gone. The trouble for the Liberal Democrats, of course, is their new Titanic seems to be being steered by the captain of the Concordia, Captain Schettino at the moment.
Headed for the rocks. Well, that's a bold prediction. Sean Dilley, as always, thanks for coming
Thank you.
on board the Sputnik. Well, now it's your turn in our social media roundup, coming in through our portal, RT_Sputnik. Gayatri, what's rattling the pipes?
Well, this week I tweeted the stats about Fathers for Justice that you mentioned in your intro earlier. The shocking stats, including the one that 1 in 3 children lose contact with their fathers permanently, which is just shocking, stunning. Nuts One replies to that, 1 in 3? I am in total shock. What has gone wrong? That can't be a worldwide syndrome.
Well, of course, the Muslim world, it's virtually unknown for children to be separated from their fathers. Many parts of the world, this phenomenon simply doesn't exist, wouldn't even be recognized. I would think it's, as Matt put it, a first world syndrome. It's a syndrome in the United States, in Britain, and in mainland Europe.
Of which Britain is at the highest.
Britain's undoubtedly one of the worst, no doubt.
It's really
The great cities of England have half of their children without fathers.
What an amazing interview we had.
No
with them.
wonder we have antisocial behaviour and crime rampant.
Because
in many
70% of the young offenders come from fatherless families. It's amazing. And now this is a comment that was the overall sentiment throughout Twitter, and I hope this sentiment will change after they've seen the interview, because Scott Murray says, how any father can choose to walk away from their own children is beyond me and disgusting.
Well, of course, there are many fathers who do walk away from their children, but there are far more fathers who are being pushed away from their children by the system that we have.
Then I asked about the political year 2013, what the
Heroes and villains.
What the people's heroes and villains are. Mark Hebblewhite responds, sorry, but at the moment I feel all politicians are villains who deliberately lie to us, lost trust and belief.
Thanks, mate.
James Hotman mentions as a political hero Putin, and the villain John McCain, because he's such a prized pillock. For Putin, he gives his 2 reasons, Syria and Snowden, and that Putin has had a magnificent political spell this year.
Well, I think there has never been a more obvious politician of the year than President Putin in this year.
Yeah,
He
I
has
agree.
played a blinder over Snowden, over Syria, and now over this provocation that John McCain has mounted. He and the European
in
Social
Kiev,
Democrats and Christian Democrats on the streets of Kiev. So definitely, President Putin has to be the political man of the year.
Shoko says that the highlight is the Wicked Witch is no more, to which Evil Macbeth adds that Thatcher and Mandela, one a hero, the other a villain, one going to heaven, the other to hell.
No prizes for guessing which. It's going in either direction.
Indeed. And then the last tweet comes from Patrick O'Sullivan, who says, "Come on, George, please tell us what's in the suitcase."
Patrick, I couldn't possibly tell you, because if I told you, I'd then have to kill you.
Well, okay, well, that's tweets for this year.
Ah, this year. That means there's no time left to do anything other than wish you and yours a very happy new year.
But do please keep tweeting us on RT_Sputnik. That's it for me, Gayatri. Wishing you a very blessed new year.
And from me, George Galloway, it's been marvellous.